All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's Trusted Sec webinar titled Securing Cloud Native Applications with DevSecOps. My name is Stephen Marshowitz, Director of Program Development here at Trusted Sec. We welcome you and really think you're going to enjoy the webinar. First, a few housekeeping items. The webinar is recorded, so you'll be able to go back and review it on your YouTube page or to go to the links on our main page under events. We encourage you to ask questions either in the QA along the way or in the chat. Feel free to send us anything there. We'll make sure we get to them either during or at the end of the presentation. A quick background on Trusted Sec. What I always like to say is the key is always in the people. That's where it all starts with any consulting firm. And knowing Dave, even before he founded Trusted Sec, he always planned on having an elite group of people that just did great work for clients. We share knowledge across 90 plus consultants now, the experiences from over 500 clients and 1,500 assessments we do in a year. So it's really pretty amazing to see all of this come to fruition. With that, I want to introduce two of those elite people, our speakers for today from our remediation team, Managing Director Paul Sems and Security Consultant Mitch Parrish. Paul, would you start us off and give us a little background about yourself?
Yes, excellent. Hey, thank you, Stephen, for that intro. And we're glad to be here today. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. As stated, my name is Paul Sems. I'm responsible for our remediation services team. And with me, I have Mitch Parrish, who's specializing in DevSecOps. Hi, Mitch. How are you today?
Doing good, Paul. How are you?
Doing well, doing well. So, yeah, super excited about this. Can you give us a real quick, super quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, again, as you said, super excited to cover it. We're going to talk a little bit about the challenges of using DevSecOps to secure cloud native applications, where they can really benefit your security program and help you develop applications faster. And then some of the lesser talked about drawbacks of security vulnerabilities that some of those systems introduce themselves. So also happy to say hi on camera. I can't open my eyes bigger than that picture there. So that terrible picture is going to follow me around forever. So
we'll get that redone soon. Stop in at our intergalactic world headquarters here. So excellent. Let's go to the next slide. Take a little bit about, I'm going to give everyone a quick intro on a few other things. So one of the things that we're going to be talking about today is how do we actually harden some of these processes around DevSecOps, but there's a lot of other areas that we can help you with, right? So as you guys, most of you, if you're familiar with Trusted Sec, know what we do. We can help you design, evaluate, harden, and respond specifically in any of your security situations. So one of the things we're going to be focusing on today, if you look at that third column over there, we're going to be focusing on the DevSecOps hardening. But just to keep everyone in the loop, we also can help you harden your Active Directory, your Microsoft 365 environment, specifically related to DevOps. We have Azure, AWS, and GCP, which are exceedingly popular in this space. So we're here to help. And hopefully this webinar, you will get an understanding of what we can do in the DevSecOps space. So thanks. Cool. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Mitch to go to the next slide and jump into talking about that.
Yeah, I'm going to pull the video off for a second. It's a little easier to go through these, and so everybody doesn't have to look at me the whole time. Yeah, kind of a brief overview of how we're going to go about the webinar today. Again, focusing on cloud native applications, using DevSecOps principles to secure them, which more and more people are doing. So we'll start out talking about DevOps, DevSecOps, and kind of the unimportance of labels. How labeling yourself a specific shop doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's more the application of what you're actually doing. Then we'll talk about some implementation challenges that we see folks commonly see, and just applying DevSecOps principles in general. So, and then before we jump into solutions, we'll talk about everyone's favorite subject, measurability and feedback. Really looking at ways to measure the impact of additional tools and processes you've put in place, and how they might impact the success of your program. And then finally, we'll jump into some solutions. How can we overcome the challenges we identify in that second step there and kind of get rolling?
Excellent.
Perfect. Awesome. So DevOps. Like I said, we'll start with some definitions, and then I'll kind of get into why, labeling yourself isn't super important. So DevOps seems to be the buzzword of our generation, my generation at least, for the past decade. In its purest form, it's a combination of many tools and processes, just looking to find a unified approach to deploying software more quickly. So how did we do that? Automation has been replacing many tasks that took human intervention in the past. Building software from source, deploying it to multiple environments, including production, and building and operating even the infrastructure. When we look at infrastructure as code, where your application operates. So to the principles of automation, codification, and most importantly, to the expansion of responsibility, that's that organizational buy-in bit for all stakeholders in the development environment. We've seen continuous integration and deployment really work well for cloud native software development, really speed up delivery velocity. There's a lot of innovation in the space, but it doesn't come without its drawbacks, which we'll cover a little bit here.
So I know with that diagram there, a lot of it's about speed, right? And so that speed comes to play, but sometimes security could be a challenge. So I guess that's our next slide here is how to integrate security into this, because at a high velocity, we need to make sure we're getting it right, and we have to get it right every time.
Exactly. And you hit a key point there for the DevOps and DevSecOps methodology, and that's the continuous nature of it, right? So speed, efficiency is definitely the number one driver of adopting these principles. And like you said, security kind of left out of the original paradigm, but then we started to notice that a lot of the technologies we found in the initial phases of DevOps could lead to improvements in the security world. So here comes DevSecOps. We're implementing and adding continuous security throughout the entire software development lifecycle, and operations as well, with the goal of expanding that shared responsibility I talked about and collaboration across teams. So involving your security teams now, finding ways you can inject security throughout this entire process and in each phase that you see there on your screen. And the way that we've been able to achieve this is through the same thing that made DevOps popular, right? It's automation, it's codification of everything or almost everything. And you see that in security as code, as policy as code, open policy agent. Most people are familiar with OPA, which provides safety guardrails. And we'll talk a lot about that too. Focusing on guardrails instead of gates, not creating blockers, which are in the software world all too common, but creating guardrails that allow your folks to really kind of govern themselves with guidelines that you provide.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Very good. You mentioned something about labels. Did we cover that adequately on the labeling, making sure?
No, so that's right. I think a lot of folks get caught up in trying to define themselves, fit themselves into a certain box. You hear people say, we're an agile shop or we're a DevOps shop, and those aren't mutually exclusive. Trying to label yourself, define yourself that way, you can end up a couple different ways. It can limit you extremely. It can leave you a bit like swimming in the ocean, where you don't know which way is up. So the key is to realize that every development team, every development shop has different goals, has different principles, different strengths, and certainly different personalities, which we're all familiar with managing. So it's important to realize there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You should really just be focused on what works for you, starting small. And what I find the truth is that a lot of DevSecOps practices are extremely typical of every modern cloud-native development shop, right? Even with teams that follow a more defined release schedule, they're doing typical 2-week sprints. They're not doing continuous deployment. But you can use some of these principles to help not only secure your development process, but drive efficiency and speed. You don't necessarily have to ascribe to DevSecOps or DevOps as a label. So I always find that to be important to call out.
Excellent. Very good. So on paper and on the diagram, it looks pretty straightforward. but it seems like there's usually some pretty significant implementation challenges. So
Yeah,
let's talk a little bit about that. So what that looks like.
great segue. So poll for everybody to look at here. Yeah, so this is one of my favorite things. I did a talk a couple of months ago, actually, called MacGyver Ops, and really focused on, before looking outward, like look inside of the tools you already use. Do some of these tools have integrations or capabilities that I'm not aware of that could solve a problem? Instead of expanding your attack surface, look inside, see if you've already got something that'll solve this problem, whether it be even a custom written solution. Like, definitely always take that into account before going out and acquiring the most fancy tool. And for anyone that doesn't know Apollo 13, shame on you, but also they essentially had to find a way to get one filter to fit into another filter using only the equipment they had on board. All right, so this is the slide that should probably make everybody sweat a little bit. If it doesn't, then we should talk for sure. But with modern cloud native development, we rely on a diverse tool set that delivers a lot of value, a lot of efficiency. But that expansion, as you see here on the diagram of the software development lifecycle, increases our attack surface. So we start to see threats not only on development machines, but now source management platforms, artifact repositories, build and deployment platforms especially. That's a huge target, and we'll talk about those a little later on. Cloud providers, logging aggregators, unified security platforms. All of a sudden, you're responsible for such a wide breadth of platforms and technologies that before you weren't necessarily, you were more focused on a more monolithic hosting and operating structure.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of moving parts there, right? And so just that breadth is staggering when you think about all the different tools that need to work together to make this happen. A lot of places for those vulnerabilities to get in there.
Exactly. No, exactly. And that's the red arrows there are essentially, anywhere in your software development lifecycle, essentially at this point, you're susceptible to vulnerability. And the main caveat there is you need to be aware of it. Just because you buy a platform or integrate a platform doesn't necessarily mean that one's completely good to go, right? Yeah, so on top of that, you'll see here the dependencies thing on the right. I love to always highlight this too, because not only do you have these platforms and processes in your development lifecycle, now you're bringing in dependencies, whether that's software artifacts, container images, plugins to your build and deployment platforms. Like you'll see that with Jenkins, and we'll talk about that. A lot of folks are likely integrating known vulnerabilities into their build platforms. So super, super important to think about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Excellent. So I just noticed on the polls that we do have quite a few people on AWS and Azure. And I know there's a lot of work in both of those. So that's and the thing is, even with there's a little bit of combination of that too. Not too many people on GCP or none, but yeah, it's definitely those are definitely platforms that we can help with, because they are complex, right? If they were simple, they would, we wouldn't need any assistance with it. But the complexity of those two environments, or all of those environments along with these tools, really makes this something that most people need a little bit of help with, because of the complexity. So excellent.
Yeah, I would double up on that and say those two topics are super, super ingrained with one another. Most cloud native shops are hosting their applications on cloud platforms like AWS and Azure, where while their configurability is essentially unlimited, that can pose a security threat in itself, right? Like,
absolutely,
they take care of security, and talking about shared responsibility, they'll secure you up to a certain point, and then the rest is on you. And that can introduce a ton of vulnerability points as well. In addition to build platforms you're hosting on AWS as well. So the scope can be fairly infinite.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think both of those platforms, or all of those platforms, have the idea of microservices, right? And that kind of leads us into the next thing, is that, hey, we have all these types of, newfangled ways of building applications. And but those could have, as the slide says here, microservices do not equal micro vulnerabilities. So tell us a little bit about that. I mean, that's pretty powerful when we think about what's going on in this space and some of the complexities that are added when we start building both. What we have integration between traditional apps, and then we have this idea that we're going to do modern apps, but then on top of that, we're adding in microservices. So tell us, go down that path.
Yeah, no, well put. And I should have added that distributed vulnerabilities equal or distributed systems equal distributed vulnerabilities, because that's exactly what it does. And that's talking back to that initial diagram of how we're expanding the platforms that we're using and expanding the services that we're using. We don't necessarily always look at those platforms as production assets. And we certainly do. Well, we see more and more CI/CD platform attacks, and that's really driving at the heart of your supply chain, right? Think back to SolarWinds. A compromised build system, in most cases for most people, results in a compromised end user product, right? So certainly things we need to look at and start thinking about, are we hardening these platforms as the same as we're hardening our production assets or our development environments? So we'll start out with Jenkins, because it's obviously probably the #1 winner as far as recorded CVEs. I think they've got close to 1,500, and a caveat there, yeah, most of them are plugins, but Jenkins doesn't really accomplish a whole lot without those plugins, many of which are open source, which can be good and bad. A lot run out of maintenance. People don't know, people don't track them. I've worked with a lot of folks who set up their Jenkins. Once it's working, it's kind of a set and forget Ronco rotisserie.
Yeah,
that thing.
There's probably even a resistance to making changes, because it's like, we finally got it working.
Exactly. Yeah, and you don't want to, you don't want to be the person that, oh, my build broke, and now you're a blocker to development.
Yeah.
So staying on top of these things. I will say, just recently, Jenkins was in the news a couple of weeks ago. That's how the no-fly list was leaked. The U.S. no-fly list was from a Jenkins instance that was public on the internet, showed up on Shodan, and the attacker was able to enumerate some build files and source code repository files that got ended up. They were able to score some AWS credentials and grab that list from an S3 bucket or the server itself. So, super, super important. Take a look at your Jenkins instances, make sure they're hardened to best practices, including the underlying infrastructure themselves. Super, super important.
Absolutely.
The next one, GitLab, and I'll say these first three are more focused on self-hosting, which a lot of folks do because of security requirements on their part. They don't necessarily want to ship their stuff out to a SaaS platform. GitLab, another one. A couple years ago, I think it was 2021, a bunch of GitLab servers were hijacked to create a huge DDoS attack campaign. It was a perfect 10 CVSS score. Essentially, GitLab wasn't parsing image files correctly to remove metadata, which resulted in an RCE vulnerability, and the hijacking of, I think it was like tens of thousands of GitLab instances. So a really novel attack. Build platforms are essentially distributed compute resources, so super valuable targets, especially if you're trying to launch a DDoS campaign.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then Artifactory, a huge one, right? Host all of your software artifacts. Once you've built them, you ship them off to Artifactory and wait for your application to consume them. So when we're talking about supply chain, if I can somehow alter your artifacts and inject a malicious artifact, everything downstream from there is compromised, including if your client environments, if you're running a SaaS or something yourself, they're now consuming these malicious packages. So not a ton of vulnerabilities there. Just thought I want to bring it up. There's a ton of people hosting their own Artifactory instances, so super important for it there. And go ahead. Do you have a question, Paul?
Yeah. So it's interesting too. You mentioned here that, these are common tools and a lot of people are self-hosting them, and the other fact of that is that they only set them up usually 1 or 2 times, right? So the depth of knowing how to configure these in a secure way is not really, commonplace. If you're not setting these up and securing them, right? People just don't have that depth to understand the implications of their configuration decisions.
Exactly. And you'll see a lot of times that the maintenance of these platforms is kind of shoved off on developers, and they're not necessarily platform hardening experts. They're hired to write good quality code, and they don't want to go and update or patch a Jenkins instance or keep track of the plugins. So yeah, that's a huge challenge, and we'll talk about that too. I wanted to mention briefly the Circle CI breach from January. Kind of to show that not only are you vulnerable to things you're self-hosting yourself, but also some cloud providers that you may delegate responsibility out to, and that's Circle CI, obviously a CI platform, but essentially they had a developer, one of their internal engineers, a token stolen, and the attacker was able to impersonate them and essentially was able to have access to all build variables for most of their customers. So, your most sensitive secrets now out there, then everybody had to go and rotate them. So one of those things, even if you're using a cloud provider and you think it's super secure, like you still have to keep an eye on it and follow any actions that may be necessary to secure that environment to the best of your ability.
Excellent.
Yeah,
great advice there. Great advice.
Yeah, and so I'd say the top 3 caveats here, things to take away. Make sure you know what you have. That comes down to, not only SBOM, but IT inventory, that a process is in place for regular updates and patching, and then that your platforms, like Paul said, are hardened and include fine-grained access controls. Perfect. Now we'll jump into kind of what Paul alluded to, developer impact. So when you're identifying platforms and tools and processes to increase development velocity, to increase security, so if you're wanting to adopt a SaaS platform or a DaaS platform to scan your code for security, think about workflow friction that's going to cause on your developers. Whether it's the expansion of distributed platforms, so now there's many different places they have to go to see tests, see results, the lack of integration, kind of the same deal. Like I pushed a commit to GitHub and opened a PR, and now I have to go to another platform to view the test results and then go back to GitHub, and that sort of back and forth. Adding tools that aren't in your developers' existing workflows really pull back and add workflow friction, which is the opposite of what we're looking for, right? We're trying to drive efficiency, drive development velocity. And then again, that management overhead of, I'm a developer, do I really want to have to also maintain our internal SonarQube instance? Like I'm certainly not going to spend as much time securing that as I am writing code, which is my primary job. So these are questions you have to ask yourself when you're looking at new tools. What's the possible impact to your developers, and how is that going to impact their day-to-day? And then again, on the right, the development velocity bit, that's going to be the result of the workflow friction, right? So accumulated tests, that's throughout all phases. If you're doing testing locally, testing centrally through CI/CD, that totality of test time can really impact your development velocity. And then everyone's favorite, always false positives. Are you causing a lot of distraction because you have a million medium severity vulnerabilities that you might already have mitigations in place for, right? So that kind of ends up being essentially wasted time.
Yep, absolutely. And to make things even more complicated with the developers, right? Lisa here on the Q&A mentioned that a lot of those times those developers could be contractors, right? And that adds even more complexity to the equation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point, because, what we're talking about so far, like this is all in the best of times, right? Like we're looking for a best possible solution, but in the current climate, you're likely relying on less and less developers, less and less engineers. So efficiency and effectiveness have become so much more important, especially when you're looking to increase your tool set or your processes to make those things better. You don't want to shoot yourself in the foot while you're on the race. Cool. So I've identified a couple of major categories of implementation challenges represented here: software development, lifecycle security, infrastructure and platform security. And the challenge here is finding a balance with the limited resources that you have. Trying to find yourself, the balance right there in the middle, where you can cover both with the existing personnel you have in place. We'll talk about some goals for that. But first, I know this is everybody's favorite topic, especially during lunch.
Yep. Absolutely. We have a poll coming up here.
So, measurability and feedback. Find my mouse here. Super important quote, super relevant. Any security technology whose effectiveness can't be empirically determined is indistinguishable from blind luck. And I'll cover this briefly again, not everybody's favorite topic, but it'd be irresponsible not to talk to it. But as Dan Gear says, how do I know how well or poorly something is working if I haven't measured it, right? I'd say the majority of folks that I work with and see, they'll throw a new tool or process at the wall, have no idea where they were before, and certainly no idea where they were after. They just know that they have the tool and they're seeing some results. So, they're on Twitter or Reddit and everybody's like, you need to be doing SaaS, software application security testing. So we bought a SaaS tool and now we're doing it. Like, great. Like, what impact has that had at all? Like, yes, we found a critical vulnerability and solved it, but what are the underlying indicators of those?
Yeah, absolutely. And because we're talking about speed and velocity, it's like trying to drive a car fast or do anything efficiently. You need to have data coming back so you can make adjustments as you go. So getting metrics is absolutely critical here.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I posted these are the four most common, at least DevOps metrics. We'll talk about some security ones next, but these are four critical metrics that everyone should be measuring. They're kind of been identified and defined by Google's DevOps research and assessment team, which I highly recommend everybody follow. It's Google's internal DevOps group, and they put out an annual report. There's a link down there or URL on the bottom of this slide for their State of DevOps report. It's a super interesting read every year. It kind of gets everybody's viewpoint on what they're doing now and in the future, and I found that it's super helpful. So again, we'll cover these shortly. Important metrics to cover. If I can find my mouse. There we go. Some additional metrics, more security focused, looking at your overall code coverage, location in the code where it's being tested, the type of testing, threshold adjustments. We'll talk in a bit about continuous refinement, and that's where you'll really dial in severity ratings and impact to your organization and your application or team, and kind of where you've come from threat modeling to decide your proper threshold. And then test failure rate, false positives, always a huge one. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of how to mitigate some of those. And then time to remediate.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. That's going to generate quite a bit of data coming in, and a lot of feedback if we set these up. So help us understand how we can take advantage of that, all that data coming back. We have some metrics coming in now. We've gone through, we've set these metrics up and we're watching them. How can we take advantage of that data that's coming in?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying those are definitely great questions to be asking. I think when you're going through the procurement process, you need to be asking questions like that. Do any of my tools offer this capability? As far as metrics go, do I have the potential to write the integration myself? And then if I'm looking at a new tool, does it have the ability to integrate back into the tools I'm already using? I'm a huge proponent of a developer first mindset of saying, keep your developers in their existing workflow. So does this tool provide feedback within the workflow and with existing tools that I may have? So yeah, super important. You've got a ton of information coming at you. How do you leverage it versus management? How do you make it valuable? And this kind of goes into my whole idea of solving these problems to begin with. And that's continuous feedback. So many of these practice tools, they can provide you continuous feedback and help you inform every phase of development and operations. Again, with the goal of leveraging it. So starting small, making continuous refinements, being super intentional about your data sources, that's key to making it all work, right? If you have a big organization with a lot of teams, you're not going to take this new program or all this feedback and try and make a run for it, right? You're going to start small, start with a specific project and look at feedback from threat modeling, testing, bug and hot fixes, monitoring, security assessments. And these are things you can implement in your day-to-day development practices, right? Stand up is a huge opportunity to go over bug and hot fixes. Sprint reviews the same way. Security champion program, if you have one, presenting results from threat modeling, or bring in the security folks to go over, a collected view of testing results. Like, this was the last couple sprints testing results. And are there things we can identify that we know are a problem, or know that, our risk appetite allows us to not care so much about that, and really tailor this feedback to things that you actually care about. My saying is always let your threat model be your guide, and we'll definitely talk a little bit more about that. And again, just wanted to reiterate that all those feedback sources that we just talked about and listed should really always go back to inform the previous phases and the preceding phases, right? So if I have feedback from local application security testing, maybe I can implement that into my central AST program and write better rules, or rules that I know aren't going to duplicate. So just always keeping in mind that all of your feedback should consistently and continuously inform all phases of the development life cycle.
Absolutely. There was a question on here that someone asked specifically around QA and their role in this process. And, maybe you can jump a little bit, talk to that for a second or two.
Let me pull that up. Yeah, so on testing for sure, and it might, if I go back here one more. So testing, that can be both. I've seen it done 1,000 different ways in different organizations, where QA takes responsibility for security testing too. So they're the ones leading the writing of AST rules, or they're doing manual verification. So it really depends on the organization again. If your QA team has a specialty in security, which even if they don't necessarily have formal training or previous work experience, if that's something that they're, been identified as a security champion or something, like certainly involve them. And then, they're then the source of the continuous feedback as well. So I know most people still rely on a large combination of QA and QA-led automation testing, in addition to those external platforms that handle it through automation. So hopefully that.
Yep, I think that does. Yeah.
All right, we'll jump into some solutions. Getting started. So as everybody remembers from Jurassic Park, it's not a race, just trying to get over the fence safely and securely. But we all know you don't want to get stuck on the fence, right? Like it's not a race, but it kind of is not a race. So we'll walk through each phase here, the software development lifecycle, one by one. But when we look at a client environment, we do look at all these components provide a holistic assessment and roadmap for hardening the software development lifecycle and operations environment by applying these DevSecOps principles that we've spoken about. So certainly when you're seeing these, you're seeing all these processes and tools pop up, these are things to get your mind working, to start thinking about. They're certainly not meant to be tackled all at once. That would be detrimental. But do realize that not every tool or process we talk about is applicable to everyone. Again, let your threat model kind of be your guide here. So we'll start at design. That's the kind of the marketing buzzword, right? Is shift left. And if you take one step backwards, you realize shifting left is just applying defense in depth principles that we're all super familiar with. So that's the way I like to think about it, is just layered security throughout the software development lifecycle, which means that obviously you're going to start at the beginning. So with that being said, the design phase, application security standard, absolutely crucial, even if it's an adopted standard that's published out there already. This is kind of your founding document, if you will. If you don't have an application security standard, it's hard to inform the later tools and processes you put in place, because you don't necessarily know what goals you're trying to solve for. And that brings us into threat modeling, which should help inform that process as well. What are the threats that I'm facing? What am I doing about it? How can I do it better? Just knowing the attack vectors that you're subject to is super important, especially when you're trying to provide targeted protections with limited personnel and technology. Design intentionality. This is a big personal thing for me. I've seen too many organizations and folks just go out and acquire tools, not necessarily train anyone on how to use them, not design anything with intentionality. It's just more of a checklist approach of, I need this, and I need this. Being super intentional, making sure that you can integrate these solutions into your existing workflow, and that your personnel are comfortable using them and know how to use them. Portability, super important on the scaling front, right? You want to be able to solve once and apply 1,000 times. If you can create solutions that you can then apply to different applications as you build them, that's going to save you a ton of time and effort in the long run, especially with the codification of everything, right? With infrastructure as code, with policy as code, you can write these guardrails, they're codified, and then you can apply them to new projects down the road once you've had that opportunity to kind of really drill in the process and make things work for you. And then holistic dependency awareness. Obviously, supply chain, it's been a topic throughout this webinar, but super, super important to be aware of your entire dependency chain, whether it be from, again, Jenkins plugins to container images that you're building from. We starting to see a lot of organizations really starting to focus on the SALSA framework a lot more, and just trying to provide that kind of dependency trust throughout the life cycle, so that by the end of the game, you know what you're working with.
Yeah. So building those security principles all the way in the beginning, right? So, championing that idea with those product managers who are responsible for those products and the development, making sure that they understand how important it is to build security in natively to the processes. Seems like that's a very important part of this process.
Yes, and the design phase is a great opportunity to pull in the entire stakeholder team, right? Everyone in the organization that has a hand or a stake in the application or the operation of the application. During the development of the security standard, you can have representatives from every team. Threat modeling, you should have representatives from every team. When you're considering design, there should be someone from every team. So that kind of grows that team collaboration mindset that's so important to DevSecOps. And being successful on these later phases where things might be split up a little bit more depending on the makeup of your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. That collaboration is definitely key. There was a question if we had any sources for draft application security standards. Maybe what we can do with that one is at the end of this, post some links, and there might be some that we can post later. So we'll hold that. Lisa will answer that question at the end of this one. So just want to be on that.
Perfect. Yeah, and I would just say there's definitely a ton out there, and like I said, in the spirit of making it unique to your organization too, like you definitely can cherry pick things that are applicable to you or things that are important to the threat profile of your organization and kind of make it your own. Like that's, a great opportunity to have collaboration on security and make people a little bit more aware of it. The development phase, and again, these are all things that when we go into an organization, we look at every area of this to see if one, if you're doing it in the first place, and two, if it's actually effective. Like just because you're doing it doesn't mean that it's actually resulting in the expected outcome or the desired goal. So on a developer workstation, you can start to look at integrating SAST. I should have spelled some of these acronyms out. I'm a recovering Fed, so I speak in acronyms all the time. That's static application security testing. Developer workstation, there's so many integrations with tools your developers are already using, VS Code, a ton of plugins, and they exist for every IDE out there. You can also start to think about leveraging Git hooks, super powerful, especially for sensitive data discovery. There's a lot of tools out there that are free and open source that will prevent you from ever committing a secret to your GitHub repository, which more and more our penetration testers continuously find, like I said, more and more sensitive data in GitHub repositories. And then you can implement push protection to, if Git hooks aren't working or passing, just deny the push altogether. And then commit signing, again, talking about SALSA compliance and thinking more and more about supply chain and creating provenance and at least some trust initially. Commit signing is huge, and platforms like GitHub are making that easier and easier all the time. And then again, constant dependency awareness.
You mentioned the SALSA framework that is really around that idea of making sure that pedigree is well documented, and that's definitely going to be more and more important as we deal with these supply chain issues, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that is 100% the future of where we're headed. If only could have happened before now, but I think it's going to be very powerful in artifact trust, and I think it'll be. We see it every day. More and more organizations are trying to get there, and that's a great thing to see. And I think it is because of all the high profile supply chain attacks out there, and obviously nobody wants to be the upstream developer of a vulnerability. Awesome. Brings us into build platform. Like I said, this is probably the primary target of most of our successful testing. As far as penetration testing goes, this is a key component of your software supply chain. But beyond the build platform configuration, which I've kind of got down there at the bottom, you can conduct centralized application security testing. both static, dynamic. So you can kind of offload some of this testing from local machines so that it can be run on schedule or only on PRs, so that we can kind of keep an eye on what we talked about earlier, that cumulative testing time. You always want to kind of keep that down. Here's software composition analysis. We're looking at container images that we're building from, kind of keeping that dependency awareness, constantly thinking about that. In fact, there was a report, Sysdig just came out with a really good report this week, actually. And their number was 87% of container images have high or critical vulnerabilities. So that's pretty, I didn't think the number would be that high. But that's an important thing to think about too. Just because a salsa artifact was classified at a certain level, at some point, if it, it's transitive, that level can go up or it can go down based upon, whoever the last party was that touched it.
Absolutely, yeah.
SBOM generation, also another huge topic, just knowing what you have, so you can better respond to vulnerabilities and patching. A lot of great automated tools that you can offload into your CI/CD stack for that. Again, sensitive data discovery, artifact signing. So think about container images, think about binaries. We're going to run up against the clock, so we'll talk fast. Deployment, artifact verification. So think of, I've signed all these artifacts, but what good does that do if I'm not actually verifying that artifact signature? Just because the artifact itself is signed doesn't portray trust, right? Like I need to actually have a mechanism in place to verify that artifact. Deployment control, I see this one a lot, especially with Jenkins, not to continually pick on them, but where every developer will have the same access to the Jenkins instance. Any developer can kick off a build. The Groovy script console is there for everyone. Just kind of those basic hardening techniques that should be done at the onset, that were kind of pushed to the side in lieu of speed, which obviously we see a lot. Again, artifact registry configuration. These bottom bullets kind of go back into the platform and infrastructure hardening bit, as those two kind of components of this whole deal, right? So is access to your artifact registry controlled? Is access to your deployment platform controlled?
So that's a real quick on that one. That's super important. That's where that overlap comes in. So there's the traditional, hardening of your cloud environment or your servers and that infrastructure that one slide showed. But then there's the tools that run on top of it. So those are both in either one of those could be definitely flawed, or both of them could be flawed. So yeah, looking at it with multiple disciplines is probably an important part. And I know, someone asking a little bit about roles and some of the complexities there, but it gets back to that collaboration, right? So you need different disciplines speaking different languages. The infrastructure team probably speaks different languages than the DevOps team and the developers do, but it really comes down to making sure they're all on the same page and have a good mindset, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that kind of goes back to involving all of these folks from the beginning, in that design phase and then throughout. Most of the teams I work with do have a good representation of the security team, of the infrastructure team. If not on daily stand-ups, they're doing it sprint reviews or through weekly meetings. But yeah, I mean, that's the challenge with security across any discipline, right? Is typically the prioritized bit is the bit that shows direct revenue, right? So security is not necessarily always top of mind, but the more and more attacks we see, you certainly see the priority kind of shifting a little bit and going that right direction. And I think, especially with DevSecOps and the codification bit, makes it super easy for developers to have constant awareness, right? Either through seeing the code, doing PRs, or just through that continuous feedback loop that we've been talking about. And then finally, the operation phase, centralized logging and monitoring. That's a huge one. If you're shipping all of your application logs and infrastructure logs to a self-hosted instance in your AWS account that's itself not hardened, you've essentially got a wealth of information there that attackers could grab. Handling application secrets. Again, we've talked about through the previous phases about how to prevent those from getting into your application source code, but we do continuously over and over and over find AWS credentials, service credentials, and application source code that's sitting in, say, the application source code for a Lambda application that's in S3, right? So having ways to look for application secrets on the operation side is huge. And then finally, maintaining environment boundaries. The cloud providers have made this so much easier, especially AWS Azure, being able to separate your environments into different accounts and having near absolute isolation has been made super, super easy. So something to consider, especially if you're building new projects.
Yeah, I think there was a question there about isolation. So yeah, definitely that what you were just talking about is important and needs to be reviewed. And there's the Peach framework and things like that we can talk about, but isolation, super important there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Especially with what in the United States will be definitely the coming data privacy regulations at the federal level. I would expect that to be an area that's going to be that's going to explode. So definitely better to be ahead of that, especially on the data segregation point. And then kind of to tie it up, integrating feedback back into the development workflow. So a theme throughout the webinar has been developer-first solutions, continuous feedback, and being intentional about your tools. So finding a way for those tools to be integrated back into the developer workflow is going to be huge. It's going to mitigate developer friction and velocity loss. An example of that is this. I just pulled a Sonar Cloud example because I was working on a project with that earlier. If I'm a developer and I can push code and then tests run somewhere in Cloudland, and then I go back to GitHub to open a PR, and here's results from a bunch of testing. I don't have to go to a different website. Operations doesn't have to set up SSO for me to go there. Everything I need to know is presented here in my PR workflow that I'm already working in to begin with. And I find this drives developer buy-in. You're kind of doing a bottom-up approach by allowing your developers to have access to this information without having to do a whole runaround. So I'm a big fan of pull request decorations. As you can see, more and more platforms are creating these as a feature. Super slick, super nice. Push protections we talked about. And then integrations with your existing platforms, right? Your collaboration platforms, Jira or Basecamp. And then communication platforms, especially from a DevSecOps side, super important. I always talk to clients about having some type of build notification, either go to your Slack channel or Teams channel that's just for build and deploy actions. And that just adds a different, another layer of security, whether, we usually deploy at this time on this day, or our teams work in this time zone. And if I see a build or deployment action that seems a little suspicious, like that's just another level of human eyes you can have on it. And you can also provide results in most of those platforms as well. So just keeping it all together makes it quite a bit easier for everyone. Cool. And then finally, realize that this process, like everything else in development, is going to be continuous refinement, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. hopefully over time, you've started small. You've applied some of these solutions, to 1 or 2 projects at a time, made them successful. Developers have bought in. You've learned how to write testing rules that are more efficient. You've learned which vulnerability levels you can deprioritize, or you've learned how to limit false positives. And then you expand that out to your organization into more projects, and you continuously refine them. And that should, over time, drive efficiency and effectiveness. But always important to know going in that it's not going to be set it up and forget it. It's going to be you're along for the ride for sure.
Absolutely. It's a definitely evolving threats, and needed to be able to defend against the newest thing that came out, because static there's not much that's static out there. Yeah. Hey, are there some additional resources or guidance that we can provide folks? Yeah.
I'm certainly glad you asked, Paul. There is 5% more webinar for free today.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, so just some helpful links, additional resources. Salsa, I think everybody should start to look at this. Like I said, this is going to be the future. Definitely not a short-term project. It's pretty involved, but I think it's going to solve a lot of supply chain issues. The CIS Software Supply Chain Security Guide is a new CIS guide from June or July. Super, super helpful. It kind of takes sort of some of the goals from Salsa and really breaks them down into singular controls that you can look at and see if you're accomplishing today with your current tool set. Yeah, and then just a few other resources that I like to look at and use. I would totally recommend the OWASP CI/CD top 10 if you're looking to do, any type of quick once over of your CI/CD platforms and make sure that they're correctly hardened. Really a great resource there.
Excellent. And Mitch, there's a lot in each of these, and it's a lot of reading and studying and figuring things out. But kind of to do a little bit of self-promotion for you, we've gone through this, right? So we do this quite a bit, and we do offer folks, if they're looking for some help, we definitely have hands-on guidance that we can provide them, right? So if you're listening to the webinar and you're like, hey, this is great, but I'm not sure where to start. And there's a lot to learn and to get going. Just to let everyone know, Mitch, who we've enjoyed having on the webinar today, we do have an offering where we can help you in all parts of these places, and Trusted Sec 2 can come in and help you across the board here. So wherever you're at in your journey, it would be wonderful if we could come alongside and help you make your environment more secure.
Yeah, and I would just add on top of that too, like I said, this would be a perfect world. So we help kind of understand your environment holistically and see where some of these pieces would really fit and some of these pieces might not necessarily work for you. So it's great if you don't know exactly where you started or where you're at or where to go next, trying to create some prioritization or a roadmap to get yourself there.
That's excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We had a good time talking about this important topic. If you take a look at the chat, there are some webinars coming up, so it would be very exciting to take a look at some more of these. We also have some great blog posts recently that are available online at trustedsec.com. Some really, really interesting ones. There's all sorts of ones there. There's some Azure stuff. There's all sorts of good things there. I don't know. I'm going to go into all of them, but just take a look. Go to trustedsec.com. Definitely take a look at some of our content there. And we hope you guys all have a great day.